In this week's cover piece, Alexander Downer, the foreign Australian foreign minister, writes that his country is, quote, trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of lockdowns. What's the way out? To discuss, I'm joined by Alexander and Professor Andrew Lee, a public health expert from the University of Sheffield. Alexander, in this week's cover piece, you write that Australia has been scared witless by COVID, creating a zero-COVID prison for itself. What's happened?
Well, basically the problem with Australia is that, first of all, when COVID broke out in China, the government banned flights between Australia and China and closed the country off from people travelling into Australia as best it could. There are obviously some limitations to that. And this policy had early success. But secondly, there are two problems that have arisen. First of all, the state premiers, the state governments and the heads of those governments, premiers, took the view that they should achieve zero COVID, not that the governments should just flatten the curve and make sure the health system could cope with the impact of COVID, but there should actually be no COVID allowed in their states at all. In order to achieve that, they have had a succession of lockdowns and the closure of borders between the states. So, Australia is one country, but people can't visit their family and friends in other states often. Sometimes they can, but often they can't, because of the borders being closed. And the problem with this approach is that not only is it having a huge social and economic impact on the country, but ultimately it is doomed to fail because it is not possible for Australia to achieve zero COVID. And only now, as I talk to you, are Australians beginning to wake up to that and understand the huge health, mental, economic, societal impact of this constant flow of lockdowns that take place in Australia.
Andrew, this is the zero COVID approach that you once supported. Can you briefly outline the thinking behind it, the reason that some people continue to support zero COVID, but also what's led you to recently question your own opinions on it?
Okay, well, I think let's start with the idea of a new emerging pathogen that's highly infectious and highly deadly, such as Ebola or indeed SARS in the early days. And the Australian experience and the New Zealand experience has shown that quick, rapid action, robust action does work to limit the spread of infection. And if you look at the number of deaths that Australia has had compared to the UK, if not for the measures they've had taken, they would probably be looking at something like 50,000 deaths in the past year, which they've not had. So nothing to detract from the efforts and sacrifice that the Australians have done. The issue, however, as Alexander has clearly outlined, is in the longer run, in the longer term, this isn't likely to work, especially now that we've got a variant in the Delta variant that's so much more infectious, as well as pretty prevalent infections right across the world. So it does call into question, can countries like Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand continue to wall themselves off indefinitely, and at what cost?
Andrew, do you think if we were still dealing with the original strain of the virus, not the Delta variant, that there would be more of an argument to commit to zero COVID even for 6 months, a year, 2 years more for these countries that are more easily able to do it given their geographical location? Or do you think even with the original strain, this question was always going to come to a head?
I think this issue was always going to surface, whichever strain we had, really. I would say that the challenge of addressing the original strain, being less infectious with an effective vaccine, the possibility of achieving that would have been much easier, whereas now I just think that boat has sailed and it's a bridge too far, really.
Alexander, in the magazine this week as well, Sasha O'Sullivan writes about her plight. She's an Australian living in the UK, and how she doesn't even know if she'll be able to get home for Christmas 2022. In her article, she mentions some harrowing examples of what's been going on in Australia. There's even an example of a mother being torn apart from her prematurely born child, who she wasn't able to see in the ICU because they deemed her to be too much of a risk, despite testing negative on multiple occasions for COVID-19. Yet the Australian public is still behind these restrictions. You cite a poll in your article saying that most would support closing the borders if there were just 25 cases. So is this a case of the government overstepping and being too heavy-handed because they're in a position to be able to do so? Or is it the case that the government is simply responding to what people seem to want?
Well, the first thing is it's governments, not government. This is part of the problem with Australia, that there's the federal government and then there are the state governments. The federal government's responsible for the external borders, quarantine, but the actual health systems are run by the states and they have the constitutional responsibilities for them. The federal government had a system of quarantine where the states, which was administered by the states, where Australians coming back into the country and non-Australians visiting Australia who might have got permission to do so, were put into a hotel room for 14 days, not allowed out of the room, but just stay in the hotel room for 14 days. So that was pretty draconian. But nevertheless, people could go home on that basis. Then the state governments decided, because they have a zero COVID strategy, that occasional cases of COVID were escaping from these quarantine hotels, as they were called, Medi hotels. So occasional cases of COVID were escaping, so they should reduce the number of people who are able to use those hotels. And so now, only 3,000 people a week are allowed to go into Australia, and there are something like 1 million Australians who live out of the country. So the other side of that is you have to pay to go into the Medi Hotel. That's $3,000 for the 14 days. That's around £1,500 for the 14 days. And you can imagine the cost to a whole family of that. And over and above that, there are very few flights into Australia. It's very hard for people to get onto a flight, and they are hugely expensive, the flights. It's important to remember that. So, I mean, you've got a situation where the governments, state and federal governments, are effectively saying that, only in the most limited of circumstances are Australians able to return to their own countries. I mean, your mother might be dying, or your child might be very ill, or you might just want to reunite with your family, as you might normally do, say around Christmas or Easter or whatever it is. But it's not impossible, but it's nigh impossible, and you certainly have to have a lot of money to do it. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars to buy an air ticket if you can get one, and then you've got your $3,000 quarantine. So it's really just for the rich, and by the way, the very patient, because you have to wait for months until you can get onto a plane. So all of this is in the cause of zero COVID. And of course, as Andrew is suggesting in answer to your previous question, this is a policy that can never succeed. It's true that not many people have died in Australia with COVID as compared to, say, the UK. That is true. But the game is not over yet. And since zero COVID can never work, ultimately it's not going to work, there are going to be cases where particularly the elderly and the frail do die with COVID. And you're seeing that now in New South Wales. I mean, every day 3 or 4 people are reported to have died. They're typically frail people, they're elderly people. But to put that into some perspective, 3,000 Australians die every week. I'm afraid Australians die, they're not immortal.
Andrew, you've now said that there's only one realistic end game, and that will be accepting that COVID will become endemic. Can you talk us through that? And can you also lay out how close Australia and, say, the UK might be to reaching this?
Okay, well, this is a tricky one because we're not quite sure whether this virus has kind of reached a degree of stability and found its ecological niche. It will indeed become an endemic virus, which will continue to circulate in human populations from here on out. And we will get probably seasonal outbreaks, its cousins, the other human coronaviruses, are winter viruses. So it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see that pattern. And here's where the challenge for us is how do we mitigate, how do we reduce the impact of this virus when you get those seasonal outbreaks? And vaccination's the key. So Alexander's mentioned that a lot of deaths are in the vulnerable elderly. And that was certainly what we experienced here in the UK. So Australia is in a race against time, a race against the virus to get its vaccinations as high as it can to protect those vulnerable individuals.
As you mentioned there, many countries, most countries, I think, now view vaccination as the answer to our COVID-19 woes. But there's still lots of questions. It very much appears in places like Israel and the UK, which were world leaders in rolling out the vaccine, that the vaccines are working very, very well to break the link between infection and hospitalization, which I think many would argue is the most important factor, and on that front, vaccines are working. But there is new data coming out of places like Israel that suggests that immunity from vaccination isn't lasting as long as we might have hoped. Now, that isn't necessarily the end of the world, especially if you're going to focus on hospitalizations over infections. But if you're going for zero COVID, vaccines won't be your solution, because you're going to have to accept that even with vaccinations, there's going to be a certain level of infection. So is this something that Australia is just going to have to come around to inevitably, that even with vaccinations, even with the solution that we have in front of us, they're going to have to accept some level of COVID cases?
Indeed. This is contingent on whether a vaccine can block the spread of infection. And what all the studies have shown so far is that it's not that effective at blocking infection. It does reduce the risk of the severe outcomes of death and severe disease needing hospitalization. So let's not take away from that. But we know that it is not very powerful in blocking the spread of infection. So consequently, to use it as a measure to stop the spread, it's not going to be very successful, if you see what I mean.
Sure. And that's fundamentally going to be the problem, isn't it? That if you're going for a zero COVID strategy, you're going to have to rely on lockdowns indefinitely, because the vaccines, while very successful on those important metrics, aren't going to get you to zero COVID.
Indeed. So that's kind of why I'm saying that, in a sense, the objective of the game has now changed. It's about trying to minimize the damage caused by the vaccine on human populations. The virus on human populations. So that's hospitalizations, that's deaths in our most vulnerable members of society. That's what we need to do, get the vaccines out to protect them.
Alexander, how close do you think the Australian government is to accepting this argument?
So I think the Australian government, as in the federal government, more or less does accept that argument, as Andrew just articulated it. But I do not think the state governments have reached that point, particularly the governments of Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia. I don't think they've really realised this. And it's as simple as this. The vaccination rollout is happening in Australia very late, and it's happening very late partly because there was a huge scare campaign run on the impact of AstraZeneca. So people stopped getting vaccinated on the grounds that, the Australian government had made an arrangement with AstraZeneca to produce AstraZeneca in Melbourne. So there was initially quite a good flow of AstraZeneca, but they were told that you could die from a blood clot, and there wasn't much COVID in Australia, not much risk of catching COVID. So why would you take the risk of having a vaccination, so people didn't have vaccinations. And so the rollout has started off being very slow. It's getting faster now. But as Andrew says, the vaccine will very substantially reduce the risk of hospitalisation or death. I mean, it will have a huge impact, as we've seen, on that. But it won't stop COVID dead in its tracks. There still will be COVID. And now the state governments in Australia are still closing down the borders and locking down the whole of their societies on the grounds that there are a few cases of COVID here and a few cases of COVID there. And they're telling the public, look, once the vaccine's rolled out, we won't have to do this anymore. But of course, once the vaccine's rolled out, 70-80% of people have been vaccinated. Those are the targets, adults. Once the vaccinations are rolled out, there still will be cases of COVID, and occasionally, sadly, people will still die with COVID. I mean, COVID is just going to be one of the risks of life, of which there are many. And Australians are just going to have to come to terms with that. Protect the vulnerable as best they possibly can, roll out the vaccines as well as they possibly can. But ultimately, you cannot close the country off indefinitely. You cannot have these constant lockdowns. The lockdowns, Australia had a wonderful economic record, better than any other developed country on earth up until very recently. But you cannot indefinitely keep financing all of these lockdowns and this sort of madness of trying to eliminate COVID when ultimately it will be endemic.